Summary at the bottom. This whole situation started a few weeks back. My partner and I are moving to Europe for work, so we hired a moving service to transport our belongings across the border. We used a website that connects customers with drivers, received a quote from a driver, and scheduled the move. The driver arrived and packed almost everything we owned into his van, with delivery scheduled for the following week when we would have settled into our new home. A couple of days later, we got a call from the driver. He told us that his van had been stolen with all our things inside. He provided the details of the police report and requested that we send him our receipts so the insurance could compensate us. Over the next few days, as we tried to get updates from the driver, he became increasingly difficult to contact. He stopped responding to messages and wouldn't pick up his phone. Finally, after 5 days, he called back and reiterated that he needed our receipts for the insurance claim and informed us that it could take up to 25 days after the theft was reported for the insurance process to start. That was the last time we heard from him, which was nearly 2 weeks ago. Since then, the police investigation was closed due to a lack of CCTV footage and leads. Given the driver's elusive behavior, we thought it best to try and communicate directly with his insurance company to ensure everything was legitimate. He didn't respond to our requests, emails, texts, and calls, so we consulted with a legal service, which helped us draft a formal complaint. We sent it a few days ago, but it's been ignored so far. Then, just a few hours ago, we found out that the driver has an account on an online marketplace similar to eBay. We discovered a listing for a van, the same van with the same license plate that was reported stolen. It appears to have been sold months ago. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact date, but the listing has been up since spring. We also found complaints on the original booking website about other undelivered items, and those exact items were listed for sale on the driver's marketplace account. We've forwarded all this information to the police, hoping that the investigation will be reopened and that some or all of our belongings might be recovered. Or, at the very least, we can file a claim through the driver's insurance, assuming they have any. My questions for anyone who can offer advice. 1. Is there anything else we can do in this situation? 2. Is it likely that the insurance company would contact us directly, or would they prefer to go through the driver? 3. Do we have legal grounds to take the driver to court? 4. So far, we haven't found any of our belongings for sale online. Are there other websites where stolen items might be sold? 5. Could the driver have asked for the receipts to use them as proof of purchase when selling our items? Summary: Mover's van was stolen with all our belongings inside. Now he's dodging our attempts to contact him, hasn't provided his insurance details, and there's evidence that his van was sold earlier this year. Any advice? Thanks, and sorry for the long post. I needed a break, so I decided to go car camping for the weekend. I didn't want to go alone, so I asked my neighbor, who was in the army, if he wanted to come along. He said yes, and we planned to leave early on Saturday morning. The spot we picked was about 2 hours away, deep in a forest. It was far from everything, quiet, and just what we needed, a peaceful escape from our daily lives. We got there around noon, set up our camp, and spent the afternoon walking around and checking out the area. My neighbor was quiet like he usually was. He always had this calm, serious look on his face, probably from his time in the army. It didn't bother me. It actually made me feel safer, knowing he was with me. As the sun started to go down behind the trees, we gathered some wood and started a small fire. Night came fast, and with it, the thick darkness of the forest. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling in the bushes. We had both driven our own cars, so after a while we decided it was time to sleep. I made a bed out of the back seat of my car, while my neighbor did the same in his truck that was parked a few feet away. I was almost asleep when I heard something, a faint tapping sound, like something gently knocking on wood. It was quiet at first, but then it started to get louder. I sat up, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It wasn't from inside my car. The sound was coming from outside. I looked out the window, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. The tapping stopped suddenly, and everything went quiet. I told myself it was probably just a branch hitting something, and I tried to go back to sleep. But then I heard it again, this time louder and more intentional, like someone was knocking on something hard. My eyes scanned the darkness outside, searching for any movement, but there was nothing. The sound kept going, and it was definitely coming from my neighbor's truck. I stared at his truck, trying to see what was going on. Then I noticed something. His truck was moving slightly, like someone or something was inside, shifting around. My heart started beating faster. It didn't make sense. He hadn't mentioned anyone else joining us. I quietly unlocked my car door, trying not to make a sound. I stepped out into the cool night air, feeling my breath in the cold. I walked toward his truck slowly, my heart pounding louder with each step. When I got close enough, I saw that his truck door was slightly open, and that tapping sound was clearer now, almost like metal clicking together. Suddenly, the door flew open, and my neighbor stumbled out. He looked completely out of it, his face pale, his hands shaking. He didn't say a word, just climbed back into his truck and locked the doors. I could see him messing around with something inside, but I couldn't tell what it was. The sound had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. I stood there, not knowing what to do. Every part of me was screaming to get back in my car and leave, but something kept me standing there. Then, without warning, his truck engine roared to life, and he sped off into the night, leaving me standing there alone, confused and scared. I ran back to my car and locked the doors, my mind racing. What just happened? What was that noise? Why did he take off like that? I tried to make sense of it, but nothing added up. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat in my car, eyes wide open, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, I packed up as fast as I could and left the campsite. When I got home, I saw his truck parked in his driveway. I thought about going over to ask him what had happened, but I decided against it. Whatever it was, I didn't want to know. He never talked about it, and neither did I. But something about that night stayed with me. Every time I hear a faint tapping noise, I get chills down my spine. I can't help but think back to that night in the forest, to the way he looked and the way he left. And every time I wonder if maybe something followed us back. I never camped again after that, and I'm starting to wonder if maybe he hasn't either. It was 2013. Our car camping group consisted of maybe 4 cars, nothing too wild. We arrived in the early afternoon. While setting up our campsite, I could overhear our neighbors with thick Australian accents, super pumped to be there. They pulled out their speaker and started blasting the Pet Shop Boys' West End Girls. We finished setting up and began mingling with them, introducing ourselves. It was a group of 4 Australian guys, all first-timers at Coachella, who were beyond excited to see the Pet Shop Boys that year, hence the West End Girls soundtrack. At first, they seemed like a friendly bunch. As the day turned into night, their excitement only grew. By the time it was dark, I had heard West End Girls around 10 times. The song wasn't on a loop exactly, but they kept playing that tune, which I actually like. But seriously, enough is enough. They kept drinking and getting louder, and they continued playing West End Girls. By 1 a.m., I thought they would finally calm down and get some sleep. Boy, was I wrong. These guys partied all night, like literally all night. They kept the noise up past 4 a.m., and I barely got any sleep for day 1. I was so frustrated and angry that we ended up with these neighbors by chance. I stayed in my tent as long as I could, trying to catch any extra minutes of sleep. I finally emerged around 8 a.m. and saw all 4 Aussies passed out on top of their tent, which was completely collapsed and broken. They were literally sprawled out on the ruined tent in the sun, without any canopy. The icing on the cake was that one of the guys was completely naked, passed out on his stomach with a glow stick sticking out of his rear. This was before they started selling canopies and tents at the general store, so these guys were without a tent the entire weekend. They didn't even make it into the festival on Friday. I returned to the campsite early on Friday evening to recharge and grab a jacket. And there they were, sitting in the middle of their mess, hungover, hurting, and very quiet. When I came back after the festival ended around 1:30 a.m., they were still sitting and lying around, super quiet. The best part was that we got to return the favor. Our group was partying hard that night, and they actually asked us to keep it down. We all laughed and kept on partying. They finally made it into the festival on Saturday and got to see their pet shop boys. Thankfully, they weren't nearly as wild on Saturday night as they were on day 0. In the end, it all worked out. It was a rough start to the weekend, but I'm glad I have the story to tell. I took my son camping in the car for the first time last summer. It was something I had been looking forward to for a long time, a chance to spend time together and escape the busy city. We drove out to a spot I had camped at before, hidden deep in the woods near a quiet lake. The area was pretty far out, and we didn't see any other cars on the dirt road that led us there. We spent the day setting up our camp, fishing, and walking around the woods nearby. My son, only 8 years old, was full of energy and excitement. By the time the sun started to go down, we were both tired but happy. After dinner, we decided to sleep in the car. I folded down the back seats, spread out our sleeping bags, and made sure my son was comfortable before we settled in for the night. The night was quiet, with only the sounds of the forest around us. My son fell asleep quickly, but I stayed awake for a while, just listening to the wind in the trees and the occasional rustling of leaves. Eventually, I fell asleep too. I woke up suddenly, unsure of what had woken me. The car was dark, and for a moment, I couldn't figure out what was wrong. Then I saw the faint glow of my phone on the dashboard, showing the time, 2:13 a.m. There was a strange feeling in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced over at my son, who was still asleep, his small face peaceful in the dim light. Then, I heard it, a soft, muffled sound coming from outside the car. It was low and steady, like footsteps on the gravel road we had driven in on. My heart started pounding as I listened closely, trying to convince myself it was just an animal or the wind. But the sound got closer, more certain. It wasn't the random noise of a wild animal. It was something or someone coming toward us. I tried not to panic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in danger. Slowly, I reached over and locked the car doors, careful not to make any noise. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there. We were miles from the nearest town, deep in the woods, and no one knew exactly where we were. The footsteps stopped right outside the car. I held my breath, listening, waiting. The only sound now was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I felt a cold sweat on my skin as I stared out into the darkness, unable to see anything beyond the faint outline of trees. Then, there was a light tapping on the window next to me, just a soft knock, like someone trying to get my attention. My heart nearly stopped as I slowly turned my head, expecting to see something terrible. But there was nothing there, just darkness. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. The tapping came again, softer this time, like whoever or whatever was out there knew I was awake. I reached for my phone, careful not to wake my son. My hand shook as I tried to turn on the screen without making any noise. I had no service, no way to call for help. That hit me hard, and I felt trapped, like the car had suddenly gotten much smaller. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The footsteps began again, this time moving away from the car, back down the gravel road. I didn't relax until the sounds faded into the distance, lost in the woods. Even then, I couldn't sleep. I sat up, watching the darkness, every muscle in my body tense, ready to react if the sounds came back. When the first light of morning finally broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost brought tears to my eyes. My son woke up, stretching and yawning, completely unaware of what had happened during the night. We packed up quickly, and I drove us out of the woods without looking back. I didn't tell my son about the footsteps, the tapping, or the fear that gripped me for hours. I didn't want to scare him or make him afraid of camping. But I knew then that something had been out there, something that shouldn't have been. I haven't gone back to that spot since, and every time I think about it, that same uneasy feeling comes back. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't just my imagination. It was someone. And the more I think about it, the more I wonder what they wanted, why they were there in the middle of the night. I can't shake the thought that they were looking for something or someone, more than just a quiet campsite. And the worst part? I'll never know what would have happened if I hadn't woken up, if I hadn't locked the doors. Whatever that was out there, it wasn't just passing by. It knew we were there, and it was watching us. I was driving down a lonely highway with no signs of life around me. After hours of being on the road, my eyes were getting tired, and the sun was nearly gone. I realized the next town was still far away, and I didn't have the energy to make it there. I spotted a small dirt road leading off the highway, and on a whim, I decided to take it. It led me to a clearing surrounded by thick trees. It seemed like a good enough place to stop for the night, so I pulled over, turned off the car, and settled in. I'd slept in my car before, so I wasn't too worried. I leaned back in the driver's seat, wrapped a blanket around myself, and closed my eyes. The only sounds were the wind blowing through the trees and the occasional cricket chirping. It was pitch dark outside, with the trees blocking out most of the moonlight. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know what had woken me, but something felt off. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I listened closely. The forest was silent, too silent. No wind, no crickets, just complete quiet. My heart started beating faster, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was because I was all alone, or maybe because I was so far away from anyone who could help. But as I lay there, I noticed that the car didn't feel as cold as it had been when I first fell asleep. The air inside was warmer, almost stuffy. That's when I heard it, a light tapping on the back window. It was so soft that at first, I thought it might just be a branch brushing against the glass. But then it happened again, and this time I was sure it wasn't the wind. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping stopped for a moment, and I hoped it was just my imagination. But then it started again, louder this time and more deliberate. Someone or something was outside my car. Fear gripped me, and I didn't know what to do. My mind raced through every possible explanation. An animal, a person, or something worse. I slowly reached for my phone, which was on the passenger seat, and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but it wasn't strong enough to see far beyond the car. I pointed it toward the back window, but all I could see was my own reflection. I couldn't decide whether to get out of the car or stay put. The thought of stepping outside into the pitch-black night made my skin crawl. But staying inside, not knowing what was out there, felt just as terrifying. I took a deep breath and decided to stay as quiet as possible, hoping that whatever it was would go away. The tapping came again, this time on the side window, closer to where I was sitting. It was louder now, more persistent. My hand tightened around the flashlight, my knuckles turning white with fear. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Slowly, I turned my head toward the side window, barely able to breathe. There was nothing there, just the dark shape of the trees outside. But I knew something was out there. The tapping continued, moving around the car, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. Panic started to set in, and I fumbled with the keys, trying to start the car with shaking hands. The engine finally roared to life, and the headlights cut through the darkness, showing nothing but the empty clearing. Without thinking twice, I slammed my foot on the gas and sped down the dirt road, the tires kicking up dust and rocks as I went. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing. The tapping had stopped, and the night was quiet again as I raced down the highway. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. I parked under a bright streetlight, locked the doors, and sat there, too scared to close my eyes. Whatever had been out there in the dark still haunted me. The thought of it wouldn't leave my mind. The tapping on the window, knowing I was there, and waiting for me to acknowledge it. Even now, whenever I think about camping alone, that night comes back to me. The silence, the tapping, the feeling of being watched. I never did figure out who or what it was, and maybe that's for the best. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving alone, I can still hear that tapping sound in my head, and I know deep down that whoever was out there that night, they weren't just passing by. They were looking for something, and I was just lucky they didn't find it. But I'm not sure how long my luck will hold out. My girlfriend and I were in our van late at night, deep in the remote forests of Utah. We were getting ready to sleep when she suddenly saw a shadow of a person move quickly past the window. I didn't see it myself, but she let out a scream. I went outside to check and found nothing. That night, we huddled together, but I couldn't sleep because she kept clinging to me, and it was uncomfortably hot. Fast forward to around 2 a.m., and I swear I saw someone dash past the window. I shoved my sweaty girlfriend off me and rushed to the window to get a better look. I saw something large disappear into the trees. Trying to be brave, I decided to go check it out. But honestly, being in the middle of nowhere, just the two of us, I was terrified. As I walked into the woods, I noticed a pair of eyes staring up at me from below. I was standing on a small ridge. The creature let out a loud scream, like a howler monkey, and ran off deeper into the woods. I couldn't make out its size because of my vantage point, but I didn't stick around to find out. It grunted and breathed heavily as it ran off, like someone who had been smoking for decades. It was dark, but it looked human. I didn't get many details because I was scared out of my mind, and my flashlight was barely working. I decided enough was enough and sprinted back to the van. I was freaking out, but then again, it could have just been a homeless person searching for cigarettes, 50 miles into the middle of nowhere. I told my girlfriend it was a bear, and we got out of there as fast as we could. What's the scariest experience you've ever had? Please share. In the winter of 2018, I packed up all my belongings into my camper van and moved to Bernal Heights, a hilly neighborhood in San Francisco. After a break-in, an expensive tow, and catching a cold that left me unable to work, I decided to cut my losses and found an apartment. I'm sharing this to tell my story and offer advice in case you're thinking about van camping in SF. It's a strange time to move to the city with COVID and everything, but I imagine some service workers still in the city might find this helpful. You might wonder what kind of person van camps in a city. I've met 3 types. 1, the tech nomad, a vanlifer who lives off the amenities provided by their tech office. Think about it, if your workplace offers a gym, meals, and a community, why bother renting an apartment? There are plenty of stories about this happening at companies like Google and Facebook. 2. The true adventurer. A vanlifer who's genuinely passionate about the outdoors and works seasonal or part-time jobs in the city to save up for long-term travel. Picture a construction worker living in the dog patch. 3. People who are actually homeless. I was somewhere between the first and second types. I had this privilege. My motivation was that I wanted to make the big move to the city, and I felt there was no better way to immerse myself in a city full of transient people than to live out of my car. I also wanted to save on rent. It was great. At first, I felt like I had an advantage over my friends living in 3-story apartments. While they were paying through the nose for overpriced rentals, I actually owned a home that I could take with me on weekend trips. I could easily leave the city and still have all the comforts of home. Refrigerated food, oven-baked treats, a queen-size bed. I even looked good and was clean. I would hit the gym before and after work to shower. And since it was so convenient, I'd squeeze in a workout. This is how I showed up to work every day with freshly damp hair and a post-workout glow. Then everything went wrong. Someone tried to break in. One night, while I was lying in bed, I heard the driver's side door open. I sat up and looked around. The streetlight was shining into the front cabin. Suddenly, the door closed, and I heard footsteps circling the van. I think the guy was looking for a bigger unlocked door, but he got lucky with the driver's door. It was the only one that wasn't working properly, so I crept out of bed and pulled it closed, waiting for him to finish his loop and try opening it again. He came back, started to pull. After a brief struggle, he gave up and left. I looked at my watch and realized I had to go to work in 3 hours. Despite the adrenaline, I went back to bed because I was exhausted. Sleeping in your van is like camping sleep. It's cold, and you hear everything outside. It's hard to get solid chunks of sleep. I usually woke up every other hour. Over time, it gradually robs you of deep sleep, which is absolutely necessary for work performance. Getting cold and sick. I started this experiment in December when I didn't have a heating system in the car. It was freezing in the morning and at night. In the evenings, I could only lie flat under blankets. Even reading made me cold because my arms were exposed. I got towed. Imagine coming home to find your home gone. One night, I had parked on a slight slope and didn't turn my wheels into the curb. San Francisco tows for this. It cost $600 to get my car back, and I had to take a full day off work to deal with it. On top of that, the city slapped me with a $75 ticket. Learn from my mistakes with COVID. There might be fewer people attempting city van life. But who knows? You might be reading this because it's the best option you have. Here's my advice for making it work. To avoid the problems I faced, wear earplugs at night, turn your wheels into the curb when parking on slopes, have warm clothes or heating, and make sure your car is locked at all times. Read and reread street signs to make sure you won't be ticketed or towed. Also, keep an eye out for signs that prohibit vans that are over 7 feet tall or longer than 20 feet. Be prepared to repark your car every 3 days. Buy a bike or skateboard to commute from your camper. The spot you park at might be more than 5 blocks from your work or gym. Define your necessities and equip your van to meet them. Do you need to be able to read at night? Get some lights. Do you want cold drinks on hand? Then you'll need a refrigerator and a power source. Everyone's needs are different, so be honest with yourself about yours. If you don't have a well-organized kitchen setup with a refrigerator, consider buying all your food from delis and food trucks. The economics of buying groceries and cooking don't work out as well when you can't store leftovers or cook easily. Make friends at gyms or other places. It's hard to host people at your place, so find other ways to meet people and spend quality time. When friends invite you over to their homes, bring something with you so you don't come across as a freeloader crashing on their couch. It will help keep the relationship balanced. That's all, folks. I hope this has been entertaining and informative. Let me know if there's anything else you want to know.